Kadri Hocam, siz Olgu Hoca'yı çok kısa tanıtmak ister misiniz öğrencilerimize? Birlikte ders de verdiniz çünkü geçen dönem. Araştırma konularına siz de hakimsiniz bizim kadar.
Veriyoruz hala.
Ya biz Olgu Hoca'yla 2 senedir ortak ders veriyoruz. Hatta belki bu grubumuzdan bu sene tasarımda yok galiba. Başka geçen sene Güney falan da. Yok, bir kişi var. Evrim.
Ben var diye hatırlıyorum.
Evet, Evrim var. Evrim var.
Evet.
Bu sene de dersi alıyor. Olgu Hoca tabii yani bilmeyen arkadaşlar için benim üniversitede bizden sonraki kuşaklar için de çok önemsediğim bir akademisyen. Şehirciliğe yeni bir heyecan getirdi. Çok samimi fikrim de bu. Yani yeniden ODTÜ'nün hani hem yarışma, hani Abdi Hoca ile birlikte şu anda denediğimiz hem akademik olma, hem yarışma olma, hem heyecanla çeşitli konulara dalma üstüne özellikle yurt dışını da çok iyi takip ederek, dünyayı takip ederek o ara kesitleri ve Türkiye'deki sorunları ele almayı çok yeni bir noktaya taşıyor. Onun için bu konferansta çok önemsedim. Ben birkaç sene önce kendisi de sağ olsun kabul etti. Mesela Diyarbakır Sur içinde yaşanan olaydan sonra ODTÜ orayı ele aldı. Yani biz geçen sene Elazığ'ı ele almıştık. Onlar da Diyarbakır Sur konusunu ele aldılar. Yani bir okulun Türkiye'nin çeşitli politikalarını, gelişmekte olan olaylarına verilecek refleksini yeniden kurum olarak öne çıkarıyor. O açıdan da çok ben söyleyeceklerinin çok değerli olacağına inanıyorum hepimiz için. Şimdiden teşekkürler doğrusu.
Sağ olun hocam, mahcup ettiniz.
Estağfurullah.
Umarım bu sunumumla da layık olurum bu girişe, introya.
Evet. Olgucuğum, şu anda
Ya
çok ağır bir misyon yüklendi.
Bir dakika, özür dilerim. Yani Olgu geçen sene mesela Antalya sahil düzenlemesi projesinde kentsel tasarımda 1. oldu. Uygulanıyor da bildiğim kadarıyla.
Yani Özer Ürger ekibiyle birlikte uygulandı hocam. Evet. Ben de naçizane plancı olarak katkıda bulundum.
Evet, bu senede Taksim Meydanı yarışmasının sona kalan 3 projesinden birinin yani Hakan ve Kutlu ile birlikte bir üçlü olarak orada da ilk 3 birinciden birini aldılar. Yani gerçekten yani nasıl yetişiyor ben de anlamıyorum. Hala sürmenaj olmadı ama yani şu anda herhalde bizim okulumuzda o anlamda hani Abdi ve Lale hocalardan sonra başka var mı hocam? Yani ikisini bir arada götüren pek yok. Yani o açıdan Olgu Hoca'nın değerlendirmelerini, yani hem çabasını hem değerlendirmelerini ben bizden sonraki kuşak olarak çok heyecanla, yani hakikaten parçası olmaktan da mutluyum açıkçası.
Ya ben yani benden bağımsız olarak sizin temsil ettiğiniz o kanalı çok önemsiyorum hocam. Yani pratikle tüm bu kuramsal tartışmaları bir araya getirebilme yetisi bence akademiye çok önemli bir katkı.
Evet.
Ben de elimden geldiğince o yönde çaba harcamaya çalışıyorum. Yani o şeyi de besliyor açıkçası. Kuramı da besliyor, kuramsal tartışmayı da besliyor. Yani bir anlamda kişisel praksisleri de yaratıyor, zenginlik oluşturuyor.
Daha baba olmadı da bir gün inşallah baba olursa bu enerjiyi ne kadar götürecek o zaman göreceğiz.
Olmadan yoğunlaştırdık.
Evet. Şu anda ne kadar sömürürsek kârdır.
Yes, I think our students are here.
Yeah.
We can shift to English.
Yes.
We would like to thank once again Olgu Hoca for being with us. Probably we will see him more within the coming weeks and maybe in our preliminary juries.
Yes.
So now the ground is yours. We are waiting for your lecture.
Okay, thank you, Abdi Hocam, and thank you for this good words about me, Kadri Hocam. I would like to share my screen, but I think I'm not eligible for that.
Bir saniye hocam, hemen ayarlıyorum.
Yes, if you allow me.
Şimdi olmuş olması lazım hocam.
All right, let me open my presentation. Yeah. Well, you see the cover page of my presentation. As you see,
I couldn't see it.
Hocam Zoom'u paylaştınız.
Zoom'da paylaştım.
Yok hayır, Zoom ekranınızı paylaştınız.
Bir saniye.
Yes.
Şimdi oldu.
All right. As you see, the cover image is a poster announcing the final presentations of a project, which is a product of a studio work conducted in 2015 spring semester. Actually, so 5 years ago, I intended to focus on the same issue, the very similar issue as you are currently doing, under the title of Futurist Urbanism in our Master of Urban Design studio. It was one of the first attempts of me to coordinate the studio. So in those first attempts, I was aiming to deal with the urbanistic issues in a little bit, how do you say, unconventional way, rather than selecting a kind of site for a project, for a specific design project. I was just tending to make people, the participants in the studio, to focus on a specific theme to discuss about in all respects. But before that, before sharing our own experience, design experience, later on, I just tended to develop a kind of design methodology out of these experiences. I think that's why you invited me, just because of a very recent publication, a paper published on futurist thinking in urban design. So it was the end result of this semester works, actually. But before that, I would like to briefly introduce the issue in a much more broader way. So before thinking about or talking about the futuristic urbanism, I would like to connote, I would like to give reference to the idea of futurism first. I'm sure that you have already discussed, but just as a kind of reminder, futurism is not a concept directed from politics or social sciences, but it's directed from the art itself. So as you know, it's the name of a brand of a radical avant-garde artistic movement based in Italy in the time of Mussolini. The avant-garde fascist artist movement was admiring the rapid, and a little bit late compared to England and so on, the late industrialization of Italy, and they were honorizing the many corresponding phenomenon of this rapid industrialization, like speed, flux, movement, scale, bigness, massiveness, mass production, whatever. So in that sense, they were really emphasizing the notion of future with a very strong belief in progress. And they were even hating the history itself. So they were claiming the museums even to be destroyed as the holy, places of the past and history. So this kind of a manifestation actually defined the main motivation of about the feature. But just after that, we experienced the Second World War. So the Second World War was the war of the strategies. The idea of strategy derived from the military schools were very strong. And just after this process, warfare, in late 50s and early 60s, a new school emerged as a kind of research domain called future studies or future research, which connotes a kind of systematic research domain encapsulating all kinds of analysis techniques and forecasting techniques, just to come up with an idea of future possible, probable, and desirable feature in a systematic way. So in that sense, they also started to publish a periodical called Futurist in that sense. So the idea of feature became a kind of the issue to be planned and designed in a systematic way. So system theories were also supportive within that process. So I would like to share my screen again. Turning back to the main issue, the futuristic urbanism, let's say. Yeah. So before, thinking about the future itself, inevitably, we tend to discuss about Utopia, the concept of Utopia and its derivatives, like Dystopia, Heterotopia, whatever. So why Utopia? Because Utopia creates a kind of tradition which evokes people for the possibility of thinking about or imagining about an alternative future in a sense. So, Utopia as a Latin word is comprised of two words, not, and place. That means no place. So, but at the same time, it also connotes a kind of ideal space, a good space, place in itself. So Utopia and Utopia, though they use interchangeably with the current use of Utopia, they imply something different. There is a very little nuance about that. In that sense, I would suggest you to have a look at this beautiful, very small book written by Greek urbanist Konstantinos Doxiadis, Between Dystopia and Utopia. Just covering briefly, I would like to give this kind of an introduction actually. So Utopia basically suggests a kind of idealistic socio-spatial setting, imagination, which doesn't have to connote a kind of feature. So the notion of feature does not necessarily implied within Utopia. This is quite important. So in a sense, it suggests a kind of earth-like pleasures and hope and social harmony in itself, as represented in Hieronymus Bosch's very famous painting in 16th century, dated in the 16th century. But talking about Utopia, it's impossible to mention, not to mention Thomas More for sure, because the term has been publicly, for the first time, publicized, worded by himself with his very famous book, Utopia. But I would like to mention something about that because there are some critical issues to be mentioned as a footnote about Thomas More's Utopia, because, you know, Thomas More was a kind of very true believer. He was a very admirer of Catholic Church, and he was, just because of that, he had faced with the death sentence, not only because of its politically liberal thoughts, etc. So in that sense, it also influenced the notion of utopia suggested by himself, because for him, for sure, clearly stated, the possibility of good ideal future was just a kind of godly image, all right? So it was impossible for him to construct such an ideal system on Earth. It's a very underlying assumption which we usually disregard. So in that sense, the idea of future and futurism is quite a secular notion in the intellectual life itself, because the future itself was to wait for 18th century, especially with the systematic research of Marquis de Condorcet, the liberal father of Enlightenment, French Enlightenment. In those years, he was the first time proposing social sciences as a tool to configure, to suggest a kind of futuristic setting in socio-political context. So especially in that year, for the first time, futuristic literature appeared in France as well. So Sebastian Marcier, with the name year 2440, Yıl 2440 isimli eseriyle, just after 250 years after Utopia, he pronounced a kind of utopian future on a very secular basis. So for the first time, the future was to be considered as a kind of socio-political agenda to be conducted by larger politics. All right, unlike Utopia. So in that sense, early utopias, early classical utopias, consider the utopian imagination not as a kind of earthy configuration, but as a kind of idealistic condition just to be conceived. But this is something important, because they convince millions of people for the possibility of imagination of an alternative configuration or future setting. So in that sense, we can easily classify the utopian tradition into two. One of them is classical utopists, starting from Plato, which is very ancient, you know, writings on Republic, till Francis Bacon's New Atlantis. So in those literature, there is no notion of future at all. But there is, for sure, there is a kind of alternative condition for the socio-political being. Then again, in the second row, we see the modern utopists, starting from Etienne Cabet to A.G. Wells. So they start to think about the future itself on a very political basis. So in that sense, the classical utopia suggests a very idealistic topos, a very idealistic notion of place, which is purely controlled. Nothing is exceptional. Everything is inharmonious, symmetrically ordered. and in a way clarified. You know, there is no exceptional voice in it. So in that sense, the overall urbanistic image they suggest is like a very controlled, centrally ordered, and closed. This is very important. Very closed environmental setting, as in the case of Sforzinda, the ideal city suggested by Filarete, the Italian Renaissance architect. So the reality was not like this, like in the mill, for the mill cotton mill workers in England, in Scotland. So the bridegroom of a very wealthy businessman, Robert Owen, I mean, has been one of the leading figures of the early utopian socialist movement in England in the beginning of the 19th century. He was a philanthropist. You know, philanthropist means a man who devoted himself for the welfare of for the labor class, or for the poor, you know, society, communities, whatever. He suggested to develop a kind of very well setting for the workers who had a chance to both work and improve their well-being, all right? Personal well-being and social relations as well, in close relation with the nature, as always suggested in utopian scenarios. So he has been successful in this one. So if you go to Glasgow, you can easily visit New Lanark. The buildings are registered and still alive. I don't know the program right now currently, but he also had a big influence even in the New World, in the States. So he tended to suggest a new community called New Harmony. So it's quite compatible with the idea of, you know, classical utopia as well, as you see. So, but it has not been successful. So though there is a kind of settlement called New Harmony, but there is no such a complex for working class alive. So we should mention also Charles Fourier, another socialist utopian. It is very famous diagram of architectural complex for the collective life within nature itself. Again, Phalanstère, if I pronounce correct. Phalanstère means imply a kind of very collectivist way of living, harmonious within the natural setting as well. So changing the settled relationship between the man and nature, so has been the main motivation of the utopian utopian programs, basically. This is what we have to mention, as in the case of Garden City approach, led by the father of British urban planning school, Ebenezer Howard. So Ebenezer Howard was basically trying to solve this problem with the cooperatives, cooperative movements, and trying to combine the working and living environment within the same setting in a very decentralized way, as opposed to the very concentric core, very dense development of the huge industrial metropolitan centers, which had a lot of, you know, detrimental effects on societies at that time. So the second name, so mentioning those names, I have to suggest a book on this, Urban Utopias in the 20th Century. I don't know whether you see or not. In this book, Fishman, Robert Fishman, this classical book, he discusses the third name, three names. The second one is Le Corbusier, as you see. And in this book, you see the modern utopian schemes on urbanistic level. So this book has been translated by one of my students. It's a very good translation. It's a very easy read, by the way. You know, it's not always the case to find a kind of good translations in books, but this is a very good book. If you want to read rapidly, I would suggest this one from Diamond Publisher, Diamond Yayın Evi. 21. yüzyılda kent ütopyaları. So in that sense, within that framework, the modern utopian framework, Le Corbusier for sure represents another major approach with the shift, paradigmatic shift from traditional urbanism to modern one based on three principles: air, sun, and space. Then for sure, Broadacre City, the liberal version of this modernist utopian, based on a single property, private property, and extensive occupation of land with the freedom of movement based on personal ownership of automobile. So interestingly, we see in the drawings of Frank Lloyd Wright a lot of futuristic details, especially in the transportation modes. So flying vehicles, making the air traffic busy is quite interesting in his idealistic, hypothetical framework suggestion. So we have already mentioned the futuristic images of the futurists, the leading. Hocam.
Sorry, can we tell? Yeah, why I want that perspective again? It is not only related with the city planning or a city image. It also includes helicopter, a new kind of helicopter, a new kind of automobiles. Yeah, everything in that perspective is related with a feature. So it's very important. The life, the future life, it's related about it. So it's quite interesting.
Yeah, that's true. The model represents a very conventional way of American urbanism based on large tract of land owned by single family. But the life itself, it suggests, is quite futuristic. I strongly agree, Hocam.
Yeah.
Before going on with our own examples or experiences, I would like to finish that part, and then we can discuss together. I know this has been a little bit loaded with images and stuff. Anyway, so the Città Nuova, the new city suggested by Antonio Sanella, the fascist avant-garde futurist in Italy in the beginning of 20th century, has been quite influential on our images on future. Okay, large scale, scaled up buildings, massive production, and city as a kind of machine. Later on, systematically to be discussed by Le Corbusier. So we see this image even in 2000s nowadays under the title of futurist perspective, like Jacques Fresco. This is how he called himself as a futurist. So you see the still traces of the early modern utopian schemes like Le Corbusier's plans diagram. So we should also, you know, not necessarily being related with the future, maybe, but still dystopian thought is quite important in with reference to the idea of futurism, because dystopia as a kind of bad image of the future or the doom scenario of the future represents another mission within utopian tradition to warn people about the possible trends and tendencies of today. So Brave New World, in that sense, suggests a very interesting speciality later on conveyed within movies, cinema, and Blade Runner in 2 versions. They suggest a kind of very subtle environmental or urban setting in itself as well. Later on, we come up with the idea of heterotopia for sure. So heterotopia, other than dystopia and utopia, suggests a kind of multiplicity. Multiplicity of the utopias or multiplicity of the dystopias, whatever. But it's basically the space of the other, another. So combinations of different othernesses within the same enlarged setting would be called Heterotopian imagination, let's say. In that sense, for the first time, suggesting a kind of controversial relationship with utopia, heterotopia has been systematically discussed for the first time by Michel Foucault, and suggests a kind of realistic perspective to the utopians. So for him, heterotopias connote the many real conditions coming up together within the same context. So this kind of multiplicity represents a kind of utopian essence of such imagination as well. Like represented in the very famous gravure of Albert Dürer, Rhinoceros imagination. So possibility of coexistence of something's impossible. All right, different tissues, something horn in the very illogical places on the body. So it represents a kind of a possibility of impossibilities. All right, in itself. But in a way, such a speciality represented on the tissue of rhinoceros is not that strange for us. We are quite familiar within our cities as well. And we look at the cities, our cities, we also see a lot of heterotopian coexistence in terms of the different tissues, different life patterns, different settings and environments altogether coming together and merging with each other. So even in the very controlled frameworks, like in the case of Chandigarh, planned in a very top-down process with the father of modernity by Le Corbusier. So we see this kind of extreme, how do you say, exceptions, and create some kind of heterotopian conditions, like in Hong Kong Kowloon complex, which is the most, the densest, the most compact informal setting in the world. Unfortunately, has been erased and turned into a kind of, how do you say, public park in 2000s. Just to give a reference, which is one of my recent article with Duygu Cihangir and Onur Tümtürk, out of our previous workshop experience, we discussed about design dimension of heterotopia. How can we create some kind of urbanistic tactics to come up with an idea of a heterotopian condition in a socio-spatial context. So they also put our image into cover and made us very happy indeed. And then we can easily discuss about the different time perspectives, time frames of the future. If you wish, we can give a break at that point, or we can receive some questions or remarks so far. Then we can go on with the idea of futuristic perspectives, especially in urbanism. Do you have any question? I felt compulsory to ask that question because I just, without any interruption. Is there any question? If not, I can go on. I'm okay.
Olgu Hocam, can I ask?
Yes, Yasin.
You talked about the classical utopianists and the modern utopianists.
Yeah.
And you again called the modern ones more secular ones, and the classical utopianists are pursuing the godness, actually. Am I right?
Yeah, that's true.
Can we call this classical utopianists are much more monarchic, and modern utopianists are much more democratic and are urging to address to both middle class and high class and lower class people?
Yes and no. The second row, the modern ones, are quite secular in terms of projecting a future which is possible by means of a real socio-political struggle in itself on the earth. All right, they don't postpone the ideal future to another world. That's what I mean. It's not something heavenly. It's very earthy. Okay, this is what they convey as a kind of very clear political message. We can do. All right, yes. But the others just depict a kind of very idealistic setting. Even in the case of Francis Bacon, for instance, in New Atlantis, there is a kind of belief in, very strong belief in science, for instance. They replace religion with science, but still it's not secular, all right? It's a kind of belief system as well. And within that depiction, such an image does not lead people for a struggle, to a struggle for a better future. That's what I mean by secular and non-secular. Yani bizim çok anladığım, yani konvansiyon olarak anladığım laik, anti-laik şey değil bu. Yani dünyevi olma ya da platonik anlamda idealist olma farkından söz ediyorum. Bu seküler olmama şeyini farkını koyar. Bu neden önemli? Futurizme el veriyor felsefer olan. Yani geleceği kurgulamaya yönelik, sistematik kurgulamaya yönelik bir ne sunuyor? Altlık sunuyor. Felsefik ve psikolojik bir altlık sunuyor. Politik psikoloji şeyi haline geliyor, tekst haline geliyor o zaman. Ütopya dediğimiz şey. Bu bakımdan önemli. Çok güzel bir soruydu. Teşekkür ederim. Any question more? If not, I can go on. Okay, talking about feature, we are not talking about one single feature, all right? There are some features based on the range of the feature itself. Let me show the corresponding slide I'm searching for. Yes. Let's share the screen. I received a comment. Fantasy is a kind of classic utopia. That's true. Science fiction is more like modern utopia. I would agree. In that sense, I don't use the term, I will not prefer to use the term fantasy as a kind of negative implication. Fantasy should be the very essential notion with all kind of futuristic, I think, thinking. Fantasia. Enter full screen. Yes. So we talked about alternative features, different types of features. And accordingly, we can classify different acts of planning and design within those time periods. the projected time periods. So what you see is that there are some kind of features, okay? Time, in the last row, you see time horizon. Near-term feature, 1 to 5 years. It's a kind of term for implementation projects, because this is what we want to achieve. This is what we want to see on ground, in real, all right? The middle range feature, 5 to 20 years, is the period we usually utilize in our planning studies. We tend to plan the city. If the complexity gets larger, the range gets larger as well. So within this middle range feature, we tend to steer the near feature in on a much more flexible basis, let's say. In long range feature, yani orta vadeli erimli diyelim, long range'de uzun vadeli. In long range feature, we suggest visions, all right? Visions for feature development, which are still possible, all right? And even probable. This is what I will discuss later on, possible and probable. And far feature, with the far feature, uzak gelecekte ise, which corresponds between 20 to 1 decade, it corresponds far feature. So in that sense, we imagine a kind of feature. We cannot control for such a long period of time. And later on, we have eternal feature, as you see, the utopian feature. So in that sense, the middle term and near feature term would correspond to routine design process. And when we shift to long range and far feature, it gets futuristic, our planning and design perspective. Why? Because we cannot know exactly what to control, all right? The control items get fuzzy. As you see, from pragmatic to utopian vision, the image gets a little bit fuzzy, belirsiz, undetermined as well. So when you prone to the present time, you have a very exact image in your mind. If you proceed in time, the image gets blurry a little bit. So this is important because this is about mainly about the representation modes of the futuristic images. All right. So in that sense, the alternative images of the future is currently a very contemporary, a current endeavor, not only in planning circles, but in all domains related with the city itself, all right? What kind of an image we will have in future? All kind of scenarios are being based on suggesting a kind of alternative image for the future life patterns. But it's not something new, you know. It has already started within the very early last century with the images, alternative images, alternative architectures suggested by avant-garde movement, like the constructivist movement in Soviet Russia, or later on the archigram. They all tended to imagine an alternative setting for the future city, an alternative state of being of architecture, an architect in the very complexity of the modern city as well. So alternative statements about the architecture in urban context suggest a kind of very alternative futuristic images too. And not only in architecture, but also in visual art. Still, we see a lot of clues about the new possibilities, alternative possibilities conveyed by the artists themselves, without considering the all kind of serious, problematic issues about planning, design, and urbanism. They suggest new specialties and like a new form of informal life in Lagos, for instance, like in this case, or the very dynamic, buildings, scaled up buildings in the case of Tokyo. It's quite shocking because what imagined and what exists are just superimposed with each other, and that's why they make them quite striking for our own mentality. So they also quite evoking, provoking as well to think about the alternative possibilities. When you see it, you can easily interpret in a very political sense as well. So this kind of a huge stone building can represent a kind of oppressive and a very strong, powerful ruling system or class, whatever, or a very intrinsic relationship between the modern and the tradition, history and the future. So how can react each other? It doesn't have to say something special, mekansal. It can connote something social, aesthetical, and political as well. In that sense, I can introduce our own work with after this large, how do you say, conceptual and theoretical, very brief not brief introduction. It has been a long one. A very brief framework, because I'm sure that I just dealt very smoothly all these kinds of very in-depth issues. Anyway, so we started the overall studio process with a kind of warm-up session. I always prefer to start design works in that way, without loading the students with all kind of programs, design briefs, concepts, whatever. I ask them freely to imagine something about the issue, the main issue discussed. The issue was the future settlement, the future forms of the city in the year of 2100, blah, blah. So they came up very interesting solutions. When you look at them, they look very simple, even naive, but based on these very simple models and modelings, we discussed a lot of issues like privacy, collectivity, the relationship between man and nature, technology, whatever, which are all necessary to come up with an idea of futuristic image of the urban societies. Okay, then since we divide the studio into two, planners and architects. Architects are so good to represent what they have in your image visually, but planners usually don't. Because of our education, we concentrate something else usually. And in that sense, visioning is, as you understand from the term, requires a kind of vision, an image in itself, okay? If you wanna imagine something, you have a kind of vision. You have to have a kind of image, picture image. In that sense, we just made the students read the classical, all the classical utopias. I say classical, but just utopias in the literature. After reading them, we asked them to visualize that, in addition to the films themselves, the futuristic images, suggesting a kind of future image of the city. So by reading and watching the literature, they suggested their own interpretation of the futuristic images and try to understand the scenarios, the futuristic scenario behind all those representations. In that sense, we just warmed up students with a kind of a skill to, which is necessary for any futuristic urban study. Then we, in the at the end of this has been has lasted a long time, by the way. Then at the end of the semester, we closed the semester, closed the term with a kind of final project. So the brief was very simple, but at the same time very a complex one. A smart futuristic solutions for a complex environment, acting as a dynamic system, serving for an open society. So all kind of small, you know, set of concepts require a kind of designerly response from a futuristic perspective. So we asked them a very, very utopian, imaginary responses as final projects. Like in this case, it was a kind of nomadic community settled on a mobile complex, living complex, and based on a flexible, flexibly, how do you say, reconfigured spatial layers based on some kind of micro lattice system, etc. In a way, somehow, sometimes they interact with the existing cities, okay, especially the warfare cities, to heal them. After the mission, they fly over anyway. So in this project, for instance, the Symbio means implied a kind of symbiotic relationship between the collapsed conventional urban tissue with the something else, with something new, creating a kind of symbiotic relationship between the new and the old, based on the constructivist, how do you say, a framework to create a kind of new type of communalities merging with something old. In this scenario, the group suggests a kind of doom scenario as a kind of alternative climatic condition, an ice-aged condition, which make people to settle under the ground. So what kind of, you know, energy consumption, what kind of, again, privacy and communality conditions can be spatially arranged, or what kind of productive facilities can be done within the very limited condition of underground, are all being discussed based on very simple images. So at the end, we decided to suggest a context, design context, not a project site, but a context. So we contextualized overall this futuristic discussions on Ankara, all right? And, you know, Ankara has always been the rival of Istanbul, the stepson of Turkey, maybe. Though Atatürk projected this little town as a kind of capital city of the country, we always tended to or felt compulsory to remind that reality against the very dominant condition of Istanbul, you know. And in this period of time, when we started this project, it was the period that Republican Party suggested a kind of visionary program called Central Turkey, which makes it suggests Ankara as the kind of very regional, globally at global level, a regional center itself. So it was quite admiring for a party who has been authored for a very visionary, you know, projects like rural institutes, köy enstitüleri, köy kentler, whatever. So, but at the same time, though the programmatic content was good in terms of relatively better in terms of the economical perspective, but especially it was so naive and even underdeveloped. So when you look at the image, you're seeing a very conventional organized industrial districts and suburban areas just coming together. So it was suffering a kind of imaginative perspective for the future city itself. All right. So taking this condition as a kind of given framework, they say we started to design the future condition of Ankara. But when we started, the first, as you see, the first trials, the first sketches, first drawings were so conventional, all right? It was as if a kind of planning study we usually do in our bachelor studios. Okay, subcenters, regions, the hinterlands, etc. But where is the feature in here? Because, Moluköy was here, Kahraman Kazan was there, Hasanoğlan was there, that the student himself or herself could not engage into a kind of futuristic image to be suggested for Ankara. And then we delved into a very long and bloody process, okay? Drawings and drawings, searching for alternative futures for a very well-known context of Ankara. If we gave, for instance, Glasgow or Moscow or somewhere else, which we are not familiar that much, I'm sure that it would have been much easier. But looking at the context that you know very well, you cannot change it easily. It was the very cognitive problem of the designer himself. So it lasted a very long time. And I said, guys, okay, forget about drawings, all right? Just grab the base maps and throw it out and try to come up with some kind of images, just collages, all right? Just simply put simply drawn images with a very concrete visual message, all right? Then students come up with a series of images. Out of these images, we derived some special clues to be designed later on, all right? For instance, this image was conveying a kind of hyperloop system, all right, which is quite mingled, intertwined with the very dense vertical built fabric itself. So it creates a kind of linear formation, all right? So decoding the image, I mean, this is what I'm doing. This is what we have been done before. So the ground level is liberated. It belongs to the nature itself. Everything is happening at the upper levels, all right? Very multiple relationships, vertical also movement system as well, supporting this very compact setting. That's fine. So what about the larger setting? As imagined by the early Republicans, the iron web, demir ağlar system, why not suggesting a kind of a new web of a hyperloop system, which connects Turkey to the global system as well, in addition to its internal integration. It's fine. So what kind of a regional pattern would evolve on that image? So there is no, all of a sudden we see that there is no need for central spaces. So the center of Ankara has been left for the nature itself. So instead of that, some kind of peripheral formation just along the hyperloop system suggested a kind of very a mixture at the level of city region level as well. So it connotes a kind of a new type of relationship between the city and nature too, just shifting about another mobility system, you know. And in another image, the student suggested a kind of very, how do you say, urbanistic image which challenges the very harsh topographical, geomorphological formation of Ankara. So it's very challenging. Okay, what about that? So this kind of multi-layered, self-organized system which creates another collective fabric will be possible, maybe within a very smart grid system which self-organizes such a formation in itself. So what kind of small-scale relationships between the alternative configuration of living and working environments, for instance? So we started to design at that point. First, imagining, and then the problem, the methodological problem, would have been solved easily. Instead of starting with the very systematic, configurative aspects of design, why not starting with the image itself? So the other students suggested some other alternative modes and relationships and specialities, different architectonic, how do you say, the images and their corresponding so-called design solutions, details, some morphogenetic stuff, trying to combine the nature within the very body of the physical space itself, or new clusters for the new creative class in coordination with the nature itself, but enabling the sufficient density and concentration for easy communication, for the commons, for instance, müşterekler. So this kind of an image perspective, combining with a kind of design thinking itself, represented an alternative perspective for the futuristic, so-called futuristic urban design. Later on, we conducted a kind of public exhibition in Goethe Institute in Ankara. At that time, the bombs were exploited. The terrorist attacks were being done in Kızılay. So we lost one student from METU, unfortunately, as well, as you remember. So it was a very bad time. It was quite dystopian in itself. But we insisted to make this exhibition in the heart of the city, in Ankara. When people were a little bit skeptic to go to the center of the city, actually. And we said, not finished yet. So it was the year of the government of Melih Gökçek as well. No hope, the city is deteriorated. Now it's hit by the attacks and people were losing their life. So it was quite a very dark period. This is what I would suggest, say. And we said, not finished yet. And we suggested a very manifesto-like futuristic perspective for Ankara. And we suggested very, I think, how do you say, smiley images of the future, which suggest some alternative formations for the very well-known spaces of the city, Ankara. In itself, there is no harsh political, sometimes, message in itself. No, it doesn't have to be. Just an image, just to steer people, to convey them for believing for the alternative future. You remember this one? They adapted the idea to Ankara, and they made a beautiful model for the audience. So they just tried to convey the architectonic, how do you say, language for such an alternative settlement conception. In this case, the group suggested a kind of collaboration between the tradition, the history of the city and the new settlement. That's why they call it the return, returning back to the core historical fabric of Ankara. So they just delved into the very fabric of ulus, and just like Yona Friedman, like a special city concept has been reproduced for the very well-known spaces of ulus. In this case, the Hypercity project, they suggested a kind of still again a kind of, you see the continuity of the scenarios, by the way, multi-layered formation of the city based on some kind of modular like constructivist how do you say approach, based on the speedy movement pattern embedded anyway. And this is disturbing. We also suggested a kind of dystopian sort of dystopian perspective to Ankara as well. Just after this presentation, it's almost finished, I would like to share the video image of this presentation too. And just after that, we tended to write this article that you found out recently. That's why I'm here, I think. So in this paper, we mainly suggested that little graphic. I found it quite critical because it changed the very settled conception of planning and design in terms of the future itself. So it basically suggests that instead of starting with the very binding condition of the context itself, because it's always limiting, act as a kind of limitation factor for your creative cognition, just start the process with envisioning, with the question of why not? I mean, freely, completely independently from the contextual factors themselves. I call it düşlem, gelecek tasavvuru, and then imgelem, imagination. So with the, along with the question of what if, ya böyle olursa, ya ilki neden olmasındı, diğeri ya böyle olursa, ya şöyle, alternative imaginations. And after coming up with a kind of certain image in itself, then you can define the system components, all right? The main components of this image implicitly involved by yourself, by your imagination. And then you can easily reconfigure those components in a different setting. You can easily manipulate this image by means of different recombinations, because design is a kind of recombinatory act in itself as well. So in that sense, starting with the image, you can easily decompose the image itself and bring the feature into the present condition, which means backcasting, which is quite a very, very well-known technique, method in futuristic research, futuristic studies, but not in urban design or architecture. This is what we propose. We said backcasting can be utilized within a design perspective for features. Oops, sorry, almost done. Sorry for this long presentation. I said I'm a planner, really talkative. Yeah, so within that perspective, we see that the design within the world of the possible are always a very, very close relationship between the world of probables of the science, the world of statistics, all right? The world of forecasting, estimation, projection, all right? But inevitably, since design is a kind of political act, it always has some kind of very subtle relationship between the desirable worlds of the politics. But the point is that all these domains specifically the design itself, has to be located within the limitless domain of art, which is the world, the universe of imaginable, the things that we can imagine. So there is no limit for that. The limit is the sky for art, you know. In that sense, I think in designing the feature, we should get rid of the limitational factors of the logic itself. So, okay, morphological thinking is very crucial for design, but in a way, we should embed, we should integrate the imagination itself, as Einstein says for science. You know, logic will get you from A to Z. Imagination will get you everywhere. So the framing of this everywhere depends on the designer's perspective, for sure. I would like to finish this presentation with our little dystopian video that we presented in Zukunft Ankara, Future Ankara exhibition. I hope you will hear the voice easily, because this is important.
If you're very, very stupid, you'd have to be... If you're very, very stupid, how can you possibly realize that you're very, very stupid? You'd have to be relatively intelligent to realize how stupid.
First image.
First image that pops into mind is
Ama siz yükseleceksiniz hep bembeyaz. Onlar aşağıda siyah kalacak. Sizin başınız bulutlarda dursun, onlar balçıkta bacak. Genişleyin siz merkezde. Onlar kenarda daralacak. Balkonumuz çok yüksek. Baş döndürüyor. Dünya pek alçak bir yer olacak yakında. Öyle görünüyor.
But if you're absolutely no good at something at all, then you lack exactly the skills that you need to know that you're absolutely no good at it. They are so stupid that they have no idea how stupid they are.
Yes, with that, this was the end of my presentation. Thank you. If you have any question, we can discuss together.
Hocam, I have two questions, if it's okay by you.
Yes, sir. Hello.
Hello again, and thank you for the presentation. It was really wonderful. And it derived certain ideas about urban design studio. Firstly, I would like to know what was the students' motivation into designing a dystopia, and could you really design a dystopia? I mean, what's the real motivation behind this?
Yeah, the last video was not a kind of design. It was just for the exhibition. It was just a kind of imagination study. Yeah, I mean, to configure or to depict the possible, you know, doom scenario for the city, which has been supposed to be developed under the very condition of capitalistic urbanization with this kind of, you know, high-rise images. There is no space for people, you know, for sharing, no public space at all. Everywhere is occupied by the roads. Anyway, this kind of it's not a design actually.
So it was some sort of an insight into where this is going in 20 years, perhaps.
Where this current tendency would lead us, might lead us.
I see. I see. Thank you,
as always the case in dystopian, you know, imaginations.
Absolutely. And secondly, I see that most of the designs of urban design studio are somehow conceptual, right? Because the scale is really larger than architectural scale. And so in urban design studio, how conceptual a student should be, and as fourth-year architecture students, how conceptual should we behave?
Well, it depends on yourself in your studio, how to define the studio work. I should not give an answer to that question. This should be, I'm sure, that defined by the instructors, professors in your studio. But for us, we always tend to, you know, keep the design solutions at conceptual level to enable a kind of theoretical and conceptual discussions involved. I think this should be done for the advanced architectural or urban design research studios. Yeah.
I see. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Any question?
Hello. May I have a question? You said about your design studio projects for the students. Initial sketches were all about conventional, and you asked the question how these are futuristic, and then you explained us some are, let's say, familiar ones, flying bars, or the underneath the earth. This kind of examples you explained us, and I want to ask the question: how can we know something is futuristic? It cannot. It cannot be a conventional way, or what defines a design as a futuristic design? I'd like to ask this: is there any border to that, or how can we know it should be something that we don't familiar, or how can we find the answer to this question?
Designerly speaking, I would say you can answer to that question two ways from your design perspective. You can easily change the components of design. It makes futuristic. You can use very unconventional or unprecedented how do you say, components of urban form and space, like a rapid transformation system customized by people, personalized for the personal use. Just imagine a kind of mass transportation which can be served flexibly for the persons. So it's not, we don't have yet, but maybe we will have, all right? Or you can change the relationships between the existing components, all right? For instance, some OMA conceptual images or designs or MVRDV design schemes that I remember, they changed the relationship between the different existing elements, design elements. The house is just like this, okay, with pitched roof, all right? But they are flying over, they are settled on a huge complex. So this makes it futuristic. It connotes another relation, it connotes another spatial experience itself, and it connotes another image, aesthetical image itself. So you can easily change the component itself or their relationships to come up with something exceptional or unprecedented or futuristic in a way. All right. This is what I would say principally. Bilmiyorum hocam, katılır mısınız? Yani gelecek şeyi kurmak çok zor. Bunu bir formülize etmek de zor ama yani benim çok nacizane söyleyebileceğim sanırım bu oluyor. Bu bizim stüdyo deneyimimizden çıkan dersleri.
In our case, actually, what we are trying to do is we are asking each student or each group to develop their own scenario. Depending upon that scenario, they are going to develop an urban program. So, I mean, it is open to alternatives and alternative discussions. While they are developing their scenarios and programs, they must construct a referential system. Either, I mean, in literature, art, philosophy, ideology, let's say, or I mean, any disciplinary field or mixture of these, because there are already ongoing discussions, expectations. So, I mean, assuming the progress of technology is one thing. I mean, concentrating on global warming is another. But I mean, that doesn't mean that these two does not come together, but it has to be identified. So, I mean, there are two dimensions of this studio. One of them is trying to understand and discuss the determinants of urban transformations, progress, development, and change, the effective dominancies on these issues. The other component is to find space-wise representative image, or I mean space-wise programming and physical setting and representation of all these discussions. So what kind of an environment it I mean pushes us or represents at the end of the day. That is another issue. So if you look at the history of architecture, urbanism, there are lots of scenarios, I mean, similar to what you did actually today. There had always been, either from the disciplinary field of architecture, like archigram, Solaris, for example, or I mean the constructivists in Russia. I don't know. You can metabolists in Japan. We can name a lot of people. These are mostly unrealized, let's say, phase of it. But there are also some efforts which are, let's say, underlining the concept of a push towards new millennium, or I mean next generation urbanization, like what Norman Foster does, for example, in with the capital accumulation of the rich petroleum countries. So if you compare these are different issues. If you look at archigram, for example, it is not only a let's say form-based or space-based representation, but it has a background. For example, moving cities. I mean, it is a denial of the context. So it is a very revolutionary idea that architecture and context is directly attached. Instead, I mean, if we start to move the buildings and even the city itself, or I mean, if it is open to a kind of a just mere technology-based production, then I mean, the context becomes either gains an alternative definition, or it loses its significant importance in the classical and traditional manner of architecture, which is very important. In the same manner, I mean, if you look at, for example, Ebenezer Howard, or I mean, lots of urbanistic theories in terms of the cities, there is also they are not only a kind of a social agenda, but also they represent a physical agenda, but they also represent a social and economic agenda as parallel to each other. So the modes of production, for example, is a kind of a significant determinant in the form of the cities. How are we going to relate production with housing and with, let's say, farm, agriculture and leisure? I mean, so if it is a kind of a function-based relation that forms the city, and if it is a kind of a significant, it represents significant production, then, for example, what about the linear city? Linear city, in it is, let's say, extreme proposal as an abstract idea, let's say, goes to infinity, But on the other hand, we know that, I mean, there are meaningful distances and other issues in the field of architecture. So what we are going to do in this studio, we will be all inclusive about many disciplinary determinants that are directly effective on urbanism and planning issues. And then we'll be curious about what kind of a physical output will appear when we take a position as a group or as a student towards these, let's say, determinants. In this sense, I mean, all the students are free. They may be totally political, ideological. So, I mean, they may have a comment on modes of production and commodification. So they can say that, let's say, the patterns of ownership will change. I mean, the currency system will change. The financial system will change. I mean, I don't know, the contribution to the, let's say, the governmental issues will change, etc., etc. So it may be a kind of a utopic definition of relations, human relations, then it may outline. On the other edge, they can be more technological, for example. They can say that, I mean, we are expecting a kind of a extreme global warming where, I mean, there will be closed cities, introverted, which they create their own climate and everything. So, I mean, we can go back to, let's say, Buckminster Fuller's geodesic dome or something like that. I don't know. These are just what I can think at the moment. I'm sure they are more open-minded and they can think in a more plural way. But these all will come to the table, I hope, so that it will be a joyful studio. So thank you very much.
You're welcome, Hocam. I would like to suggest a book for the studio. I forgot to bring it. Can you please give me a second? Hocam, bu arada aklıma gelen bir başka kitabı da getirdim. Usually they say utopian thinking is quite alien to our culture, but actually it's not. Though we are not that rich in literature, it's some kind of examples, but this is one of the rare one. Maybe Kadri Hocam would know, as a very intensive reader. Hocam, Molla Davutzade, Mustafa Nazım Erzurumi, Rüyada Terakki. It is the maybe the only utopian book published in Ottoman period.
Wow.
In early 19th century, I think. It's a very interesting read, though the language is quite hard. But this is so good to rethink about this imagination from their perspective at that time. This is another book I currently read. Alan de Botton, maybe you know from Felsefenin Tesellisi. He's one of the authors. Those guys, the four intellectuals, journalists, discussing the future in one round table, which is a series of discussions, which is one of them, mainly based on future. The name of the book, Gelecek Daha Güzel Günler Mi Getirecek? Two of them suggest that, yes, future will be better off. Two of them strongly opposed that the future, they claim that the future will be a kind of doom scenario. Yeah, I mean, so this is a very good reader, I will say. If some things come to my mind, I can forward via Kadri Hocam. Türkçe'de çok fazla gelecekçilik şeyi yok. Yani çeviriler tabii ki var, Utopia, ama böyle güncel, çok bilinmeyen şeylerde biraz bakmak gerekiyor. Çünkü hani bir dönemlik sanırım projeniz. Yani yoğun okuma da gerektirebilir. O bakımdan Türkçe hızlı okuyabilecek yayınlara da bakmakta yarar var diye düşünüyorum.
I think that mostly Abdul just said, but the future is not as a matter of the utopian projects. Maybe all of them, let's say, never realized, never. But they forced us to change the world, to change ourselves. That is why they are so important. We know that you showed us lots of the projects and the names, but they affected, in a way, now we live, in a way, in Le Corbusier's cities, in a way. And we try to create Ebenezer Howard cities, in a way, again now. So they affect our lives, they affect our algı. Algı neydi?
Conception.
Conception, yeah. So I think taking position and methodology and the history of future that Olgu said, maybe that in methodology part, maybe we can tell the friends, I think, Abdul, what Olgu said, that he created, I think 4 steps from 5 to 10 years, from 10 years to 20 years, from 50 to 100 years, and so to the endless. Maybe that our friends think that periods, and some of them are predictable, of course. Let's say that from 5 to 10 years, we can predict it in a way. Otherwise, we can't plan any kind of cities. But from especially from 50 to 100 years, it is really mostly unpredictable, and it's going to be taking positions. And the last step, Olgu, that after 100 years, well, it's absolutely taking positions, I think. Maybe our friends think in their scenarios in which time they are going to predict taking position in their scenarios. It could be or would be important, I think. That's all. And by the way, thank you very much. you summarized all of the history and mostly the scenarios that now we live in.
Though it was quite superficial, as I thought, it requires some kind of elaboration and development in itself, for sure. but I hope it will create a kind of framework to start up. You know?
Thanks.
No question? Remark? If not, hocam, it's the end of the session, I think.
They are in shock. They are thinking about what will be our position to the life, I think. I hope, at least.
By the way, what Abdul just said is quite critical. What I suggested as a kind of methodology would be just one alternative. Okay, it was a kind of rescue recipe for the minds stuck into the process itself. If you cannot imagine, the message is simple. Just make some images. This is the most powerful talent in your profession. I mean, architecture. Architects create image, you know, and you think visually, basically. This is the power, and I think you should invest on this skill and talent in a way, especially within that context, designing the future condition of architecture and the city.
And I think that taking positions again, what Abdul suggests, taking position, is dependent on, at the other hand, in the intellectual capacity and the cultural background. So it's, I think, important for all of you about that cultural background and intellectual methodology, let's say.
For sure, they should read because imagination of the future is not just an image. I think this is what also told Abdul Hoca. It embeds a lot of background scenarios, socially, politically, technologically, culturally, whatever. So in that sense, the mission is hard for sure. And I'm sure that you can manage.
Yeah, they can manage it. They are the most intelligent people, young people of their generation. If they wouldn't manage it, well, then it is not an utopia, dystopia. I believe them. Okay.
I have a question, Olgu. In that future city sense and these projects, I just thought that is there any chance to losing architecture itself and architectural freedom in the planning the big scale and give a idea of future cities? I mean, I can't deal with without thinking about the architectural role in that city concept.
I think your question has already been answered in 70s. I'm not the one who should speak on architectural theory when we have Abdul Hoca, Laila Hoca, and Kadri Hoca for sure. Just I would say the autonomy of architecture on the city has been discussed a lot. So it has already been proven intellectually by the avant-garde movements like Archigram, Super Studio, and I forgot the other names of the Italian group. So it's already
Archizoom.
Yes, Archizoom. So I think it's still possible, but I think the architect itself, himself or herself, should position himself, herself into another role. Instead of creating a kind of holistic image for the city, they should suggest, this is my personal view, they should suggest a kind of image which will be realized, constructed collectively in long-term periods. So it will fit to the complexity of the today more, I think, and it would suggest a much more open and generative and democratic socio-political perspective as well, producing such images. I would say. So still, I strongly believe the autonomy of architecture in urban theory too. I don't have any skeptical or conservative position in that sense as a planner. Hocam zor sorular geliyor. Kapatalım isterseniz. Yani bunlar sizin konularınız. Beni zorluyorsunuz.
Ama hocam bu çocuklar zor çocuklar tabii yani.
Ama siz varken benim yanıtlamam olmaz bu soruları.
Olur olur. Başka bir göz gerekli.
Ben nasıl
başka bir göz ve disiplin ki onu da çok iyi yapıyorsunuz bence. Yani yoksa biz hep mimarlar olarak konuşuyoruz ama bir başka disiplinin bakıyor olması, mesela bir sosyoloğun bakıyor olması, yani bu arkadaşların bunları mesela tartışması lazım. Hepimiz için gerekli bence. Çok önemli yaptınız. Teşekkür ederiz gerçekten.
Ya ben yalnızca hep mimarlarla çalışmaktan keyif aldığım nedeniyle biraz olsun içeriden konuştuğumu düşünün. Çok fazla dışarıdan değil ama bu sizin disiplininizdir. Bu tür yorumları ne olur? O şekilde değerlendirin. Bana yönelik sorulardı. Ukalalık yapmak istemem.
Yeah, actually what Ali underlines is a significant and unique discussion. If you look at our synopsis, I mean, it is open to a large referential ground, not necessarily, I mean, suggesting a methodology in the sense of traditional architectural understanding and approach. So, of course, I mean, lots of issues are on the table to discuss about not only the future of cities, buildings, and architecture, but also the role of architects and how all these issues I mean, interacted with each other. But this is not new, as Olgu underlined. I mean, if you look at Fourier, for example, what he says is that architecture is a process of legitimation, nothing more than that. And so, I mean, if we are talking about a hegemonical power and production relations, architecture is the output of those relations, inevitably from whatever is suggested. So, I mean, a utopian architecture is only possible, or an alternative architecture is only possible by changing those, let's say, interactive relations. In a similar way, in the 70s, in the Chamber of Architects, at the end of the 70s, Kadri Hoca will remember in Turkey, that position of Fourier was very effective in a Marxist manner in Chamber of Architects position. So that the slogan was, kapitalist kentlerin sorunları çözümsüzdür. So they were saying that, I mean, of course, that was a kind of a, let's say, saying or statement, like the problems of slogan, the problems of capitalist cities are, it's not possible to solve the problems of capitalist cities. It addresses or it refers that most of the problems are not space-wise, profession-wise, but sourced from other issues like, I mean, the modes of production, the distribution of the income, that is something very important, and how you, which productions do you, let's say, take in front, like, I mean, agriculture or, I mean, industry, whatever it is. So in a similar way, if you look at, let's say, many of the manifests in the field of architecture, they are usually attached to a kind of a social and ideological agenda. Otherwise, it will be very difficult. And the role of the architect is also under discussion. So on one hand, we have a sense of creativity, a list of star architects, images of, creative buildings. But on the other hand, there's a injustice of income distribution and other issues. So, there are two parts of all the cities. And so lots of people say that, the architects have no power by themselves. So there's a shift that we observe from the modernist tradition of architecture and the modernist understanding of architect as the man who cures or who is capable of problem solving to an instrument of production. So these are all discussions on the table. But when I was talking to Maximiliano Fuchsas 4 or 5 years ago in Istanbul, it has a YouTube video actually. He said that every 10 years, somebody comes out and says that architecture is dying and it is architects are no more working and jobless, etc., etc. These scenarios always come to the table, not only for architecture but also for literature, for art, etc.
Yeah, theater, art.
Yeah, that of architect and that of architecture is always an issue. However, that's not real, he said. He explained it in a manner. I think it is again, directly related to where you are standing at and how you are looking at things. If you define architecture as the production of a building, as introverted disciplinary, let's say, engagement, then it is something else. But if you look at architecture as a part of a big system, modes of production and commodification, then it is another thing. So, as Kadri Hoca and myself underlined, that position is significantly important, how you construe the problems and what is significantly important for it. There are other, philosophers and architects and architectural critics who had ideas about all these issues. I think this will be a kind of a discussion, very important and integrated discussion throughout the studio. For example, another significant position is that architecture is becoming an industrial production in a way that, it becomes possible for everybody to produce their own architecture and change it and alter it. For example, in a way that Archigram thing had that with the plug-in city concept. So you have an infrastructure and you stick something on it and you can change it, you can allow a growth in the same manner with the metabolist architecture. And there's a structural base and you can put a lock and it's like a metabolism, it can grow and move and change, etc., etc. So these are all ideas started with the architectural history, like Allison and Smithson's, for example, but with multiplying house, for example. So if you look at their idea of architecture, it is very similar to the traditional understanding of house in, for example, Anatolian culture. Because, you have a courtyard collecting lots of rooms, and when a new child is born or, married, whatever it is, you add another room, another room, another room. If it is the way the house occurs, then you don't need an architect. So you need a very powerful tradition. And then these houses come together and they make the city. That is one way of having the urban pattern. The other way is planning, like Brazil, for example, like Islamabad. By the way, did you look at the architect who planned Islamabad? The Greek architect, huh, Meryem? Meryem, did you look at it? Uh-huh. Yes. Yes, because we were talking about that, because she's coming from Islamabad, and that was her homework to look at it. Anyway, and if you look at Islamabad, if you look at Brazil, for example, if you look at even maybe Ankara, you will see that. I mean, this Barcelona maybe, Olgu, isn't it so? I mean, this gridiron and very, very structured New York. Even I mean, the plan of Le Corbusier for Paris, which is even not realized, luckily not realized, and also Chicago, yes, Chicago. If you look at all these are, I mean, a kind of a different urbanism than the traditional, the pattern. So the comparative analysis of two says something. And on the extreme case, now we are also talking about building as the city, mega structures. If you go back to Oma and what was his name? Ramkolas. I mean, the buildings come to a scale, especially representing or imitating the urban pattern itself. If you get a shopping mall, or let's say, one of the very first examples is the Barbican Center in London. You know, is it a building or is it the city itself? That was the question on the table when it was first built, and it has a very unique story. That's, I mean, these are all discussions that is embodied in our program as well. Meryem ne oldu? Yok mu Meryem?
Burada, I saw her. She's here.
Yes, I said yes. I researched about it. It was this Greek architect. His name was Doxy. I don't know how to pronounce it, but I read about it. And yes, I also read about the monument which you spoke about in Lahore. And it was actually, it's very close to my university there. And it's next to another monument. And I've seen it in person. I just didn't know who had designed it.
Okay. And which university was that? Yours?
National College of Arts. It's on Mall Road in Lahore.
Huh?
It's right next to the Lahore Museum.
Yeah, I know that school, of course.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, if you don't have any other questions or additional comments, so we can thank Olgu Hoca